Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly for June 24th, 2021. Before we get rolling on our whistleblower stories for this week, Brian has a few things for you.
Hey, Kevin, good to be with you again. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. If you're tuning in for the first time, please make sure that you are liked or subscribed wherever you're watching so that you can keep up with our show every week. You can also subscribe to Kevin's newsletter, which we will talk about at the very end of the program. And if you want to support the show, if you want to support the journalism that we publish at Shadowproof, you can go to shadowproof.com/donate and see what our options are for memberships and donations. Without further ado, let's jump right in here. We have Congress saves program for commodities whistleblowers. Why don't you walk us through our first story here?
Yes, so this one comes from the Whistleblower Network News, and it involves a financial crisis that was ongoing at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, specifically the office that handles whistleblower lawsuits or whistleblower reports, and then they dole out rewards for people who come forward with information. The House of Representatives in the United States finally passed legislation to save the CFTC's whistleblower program. The Senate had already passed a bill unanimously, I believe, some months ago. So the Commodity Exchange Act, for people who don't know, along with the Dodd-Frank Act, this is the modest financial reform that was passed in response to the 2008-2009 economic collapse. Basically, these laws, these regulations guide commodities and futures trading and what's fraud. So whistleblowers are able to expose securities fraud or other violations, and then they can be given rewards. The CFTC keeps most of those details, including the amount of the reward, confidential to protect the whistleblowers. So that adds to the incentive to come forward because you're able to have anonymity. And as Whistleblower Network News reported, a financial crisis at the CFTC was incredibly severe, especially since whistleblowers are paid 10 to 30% of the funds recovered by the government. There was one reward that was going to amount to $100 million, which means it literally left the CFTC looking at almost no money to fund its operations, especially this whistleblower program. So finally, we have a way of resolving it. The bill does something that I think should have been done initially, which it separates out the CFTC's operating budget from the award fund. The legislation that passed dealt with this systemic problem. So now it's possible for the CFTC's Office of the Whistleblower to continue to function, even if that award fund needs to be replenished by Congress. So some good news, but also some unbelievable news because I didn't think the way it's structured doesn't really make any sense, but I'm glad that it's been fixed.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next story here, we have a jury awards $2.4 million to AstraZeneca whistleblower who challenged deceptive marketing. Why don't you walk us through this one as well?
In Portland, Oregon, and this comes from the Oregonian, a federal jury in Portland awarded $2.4 million to Suzanne Ivy, who worked for 19 years at AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals. She was fired in June 2019. The jury concluded that Ivy made a, quote, good faith, end quote, report alleging misconduct. And according to Ivy, in December 2018, she believed her supervisor was promoting what is called off-label marketing for Bevespi and Dalaresp, which are prescriptions for pulmonary disease. This supervisor allegedly, quote, pushed the sales teams to promote AstraZeneca medications to doctors for uses beyond those sanctioned by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, end quote. And so Ivy was removed from leadership jobs, falsely accused of failing to coach sales representatives, pressured to work weekends, and then had a bonus reduced. So the case was brought under Oregon's whistleblower protection law. AstraZeneca, however, maintains that Ivy should not be eligible to receive the damages reward or the damages awarded because she is not an Oregon resident. After the jury made this determination that she should get $2.4 million, they challenged it in the court. We will see whether Ivy is able to prevail or not, or if there's an appeal. But her lawyers do maintain that she did do some work in Oregon, and so that should qualify her for whistleblower protection under the law. But that does suggest that the Oregon state law is rather strong, and her attorneys were doing this in the state of Oregon, particularly because they believe they would be able to win against a big pharmaceutical company.
Thank you. That is some great news. Let's go over to New York, where we have 4 more NYPD cops joining the whistleblower lawsuit against racist arrest quota system. Bring us up to speed on this one.
Yeah, and let me just open this article here so that I can read to you, because this has been ongoing for some time. I understand this is something that New York Daily News's Graham Raymond has been following closely. This goes back to something that we've seen other officers from the NYPD call attention to, and so these new whistleblowing cops are adding their voices to a lawsuit that has already been unfolding. And so just to go through some of the comments here that come from the New York Daily News's coverage, we have Officer Charles Spruill, who retired in 2014, who has come forward and added their voice to this, saying on one occasion in the 40th precinct, a white supervisor asked an African-American police officer, "Are you going to take someone's freedom today?" And Spruill, who is a black cop, adds that the African-American police officer had the African-American police officer had no choice but to say, "Okay, boss." So suggesting a racial aspect to, whether that officer could say no to engaging in this racist policing. So this goes through, and we find out that there were soft targets that were labeled, which are Asian, Jewish, and white people who weren't to be arrested. Then there were hard targets who were Black and Hispanic people. And some of this involves prior filings in the case. But then there's Officer Michael Soto, who submitted a new sworn declaration that a commanding officer named Christopher McCormick arbitrarily lowered many minority officers' performance evaluation scores after assuming his post in 2011. The evaluations were used to determine which officers received overtime and assignments to specialized units. McCormick changed the evaluation for no reason other than to implement a new strategy of hunting minority civilians in order to make the arrest quota, and Soto is Hispanic. So these officers have stepped forward to challenge something that's been pretty well known about the NYPD, but to bolster a lawsuit. And I also think, based on the coverage that we see from the New York Daily News and some rumblings that were covered in the press, and you can add anything you might like to, Brian, because I know this is something you follow closely, that this is also a class action lawsuit that is trying to force the hand of agencies that are extremely reluctant to perform their role and do oversight of NYPD police. So the fact that this is well known, that this is an older lawsuit, it's been going through the courts, I think it's like at least 5 or 6 years old. The reason why officers are coming forward is because they want to add some extra push to it, because I think they feel that they're losing the momentum when it comes to the bureaucracy. And so they're hoping that this energy that they're going to bring to the lawsuit could renew some of the action that they're trying to get as far as addressing this quota system.
Thank you, Kevin. That is indeed a story that's been going on for quite some time, and we will keep an eye on it. I look forward to any other updates that we get from you. I know we have one story on here before we get to our usual Julian Assange update and talk about the Dissenter, and I'll get the clip queued up here. But why don't you start people off telling us about the next story you want to talk about here?
Yeah, and there's a clip I want to show, but before we get to it, I mean, I'll mostly do it towards the end, so you can pull it down for right now. I'll get to it at the end because it's sort of a side note to the main story, because this story involves Pentagon whistleblower Franz Gale, and he's a longtime person of conscience that is well known to members of the U.S. government, to politicians, to Joe Biden. Joe Biden supported him. And the reason why you may or may not know Franz Gale, if you follow whistleblower cases, is because during the Iraq War back in 2007, he blew the whistle on the fact that the military-industrial complex, basically its interests, its competing interests, were sidelining or delaying requests for MRAPs, these vehicles that are designed to help protect soldiers from improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. It was a big deal in the Iraq War. And it was known that sending vehicles to Iraq for soldiers would prevent casualties. It was also known that spikes in casualties were a result of soldiers not having these armed vehicles. And yet, as is detailed, I just did a full report over at the Dissenter Newsletter covering this for this week's big story, I would say. And I looked into, I went back to Tom Muller's book, which is Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. And he profiled Franz Gale, and it describes in some detail what it was that Franz Gale was seeing, because there were other contractors like General Dynamics that were pushing for military projects, and the people in the Marine Corps, where Franz Gale has been for over 4 decades, were more interested in the fact that the funds would be diverted from those projects than getting these vehicles to a war that they supported. I mean, regardless of the fact that, you know, in retrospect and even back then before it started, there were very clear reasons to oppose the Iraq War. But the fact is that, like, they were there, they knew that those soldiers were in harm's way and that they could be protected from being killed, and they didn't want to send those vehicles. And Franz Gale knew that that was going to cost soldiers' lives, and he was trying to figure out how to unravel the bureaucratic blocks that were in the way. And it turned out that as he pushed, there were superior officers who were lying to the public about when requests were put in for MRAP vehicles. And so he could prove that the request was actually put in 2005 and not 2006. And he submitted, he shared a copy of this request with Wired.com's Danger Room. They published a story. He became a whistleblower in that exact instant. And he then was retaliated against, had bad performance ratings. They took his security clearance. He was put under 3 investigations. NCIS even was investigating him for psychological instability. And so eventually he did triumph. He won in 2014 after going through 7 years in hell, as described by Tom Devine, who represented him for the Government Accountability Project. But Franz now really toward the end of his career, probably thinking about the kind of future that might lie ahead for the United States, he is concerned and has been working on the issue of Taiwan and the fact that the U.S. and politicians and lobbyists, people who have special interests, are really focused on being there and defending Taiwan if China would insist on reclaiming it. And so there is there are 2 articles that he wrote. He describes, and I'll just pull this up now. He wrote an open letter to President Biden that he posted on LinkedIn, describing what he went through. And the reason why he's in trouble now is basically because when he wanted to warn against the risks of going to war with China over Taiwan, he could not find a single media outlet, establishment media outlet, that would publish his op-ed and publish his warning against going to war. And so he turned in desperation to the global, news. he turned to the Global Times. He turned to the Global Times from China, which is a state-funded media outlet in China. And so seeing that Franz Gale had a piece, somebody from within the Marines had a piece published without being reviewed and authorized by the Marines to be published in this Chinese state-funded news media outlet, there are people who are flipping out internally and are upset that he has raised the alarm. But it has been effective. It has grabbed the attention. Nobody within the U.S. government can claim to not know now the risks that are being outlined by Franz Gale. We can get into a few of those before wrapping up this part of the show. But what I want to highlight is from this open letter to President Biden that he put out on June 23rd. He put this out after getting in trouble for those news articles, after having his security clearance stripped yet again, and after finding out that he is likely to be forced out and pushed into retirement, and that he is under investigation by the NCIS once again for writing these op-eds, that lay out in thorough detail, based on his expertise, what the risks of going to war would be and why the U.S. should not become involved in a conflict with China over the independence of this island. And so he says, during your watch as president, you're at risk of entangling America in a major war with China over the status of the island of Taiwan. You have the authority to avert conflict, but many will encourage you to fight China in support of Taiwan's secession. The People's Republic of China doctrine is one of unrestricted warfare. In an unrestricted war, the PRC will employ any necessary means to achieve its core national security priority, namely preventing secession and reunifying the island of Taiwan with the mainland PRC. And what he goes on to share is what he's gone through to get to this moment, saying Taiwan's own watershed Gulf of Tonkin event is only a matter of time, probably through an accident or miscalculation. Sensing the urgency, I submitted numerous op-eds to U.S. newspaper and electronic media outlets, but each was rejected. And as a last resort, I contacted the PRC's own Global Times, which published my op-eds in April and May. And then he points out that predictably, I paid a price as my security clearances have been suspended for cause, and I am now the subject of a counterintelligence investigation. It is also no surprise that well-coordinated payroll journalists and online commentators have suggested that I am a Beijing mouthpiece, a communist, and a traitor. But I have none of those. Since 2005, I have researched, written, and on several occasions published the dangers of America's separate relationship with Taiwan. As a Marine of over 40 years, I do not want to see fellow Marines and American patriots harmed for another cause that lacks both justification and a path to victory. I am also fulfilling a condition, he says, a condition of my federal employment by reporting policy corruptions that threaten our nation with grievous harm. So this is whistleblowing. And it's whistleblowing that can prevent war. It's whistleblowing that we don't typically see. Often we get it after the fact. I mean, even Daniel Ellsberg will tell you that the Pentagon Papers come after the Vietnam War. And, if he had the ability, he would have wanted to release the Pentagon Papers before we have been drawn deeper and deeper into Vietnam. So this is trying to stave off the kind of mass casualties, the loss of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, the threat of potential nuclear war, etc., before we get to that moment. And so I think that's probably offensive I know that's offensive to elites who think that they are right and that their way of doing things is wise and not to be questioned. And yet this person, Franz Gale, isn't just questioning them, but is using Chinese state media to question them, which is something that makes them even more upset. I mentioned these two op-eds, and I would just like to read a section from one that I really appreciated because it does something that I don't see a lot of out there. We hear a lot about anti-Asian hatred, and we all know that it's wrong, and this kind of racism is not to be tolerated. But oftentimes, it doesn't get connected to the foreign policy of the United States that is actually reinforcing this kind of a culture, this kind of racist culture, and that basically that kind of racism is necessary in order for U.S. foreign policy to succeed. And if China is going to be our enemy, as Franz Gale recognizes, there's almost no way that it can't be done without the othering of Chinese in order to accomplish the goals of countering China. And so he points out the history of U.S. othering of the Japanese, connects it back to the Japanese internment camps, the internment of Japanese Americans, the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japanese cities, and how it was deliberate that they would take away soldiers' empathy for non-combatant human beings by dehumanizing these individuals for ruthless American operations. And now he points out that the othering of the Chinese people is evident in recent U.S. news media in the form of a mix of unverified rumors, disinformation, and selective exclusion of contradictory facts. It has been reported that China-averse special interests have even paid U.S. journalists to publish stories biased against China's policies, to include encouraging a U.S.-China confrontation. Meanwhile, the island of Taiwan secession champions in the U.S. Congress have nurtured the absurd public perception that the U.S. emulating people aboard the island of Taiwan are, quote, non-Chinese, end quote, in ethnic identity. The apparent sophistication and coordination of Chinese othering are indications that some in the U.S. are working to desensitize Americans to the certain horrors of a war with China over Taiwan. Its effects are already being witnessed in American society, despite a presidential level denouncement. Racially motivated assaults on Chinese and Asians generally are sharply increasing. The dehumanization of our future foe is in full swing to the delight of China-averse special interests. Some argue that a U.S. war with China over Taiwan would be a just war, claiming the non-Chinese island citizenry deserve our protection, not just ideological support. Others will go further and assert that the U.S. nuclear umbrella needs to be extended to encompass the island. They try to make the desperate case that the island of Taiwan is the last bastion of American values in Southeast Asia and the final barricade that contains China. So it's very eloquently put. He does a very good job of laying out the case. And in both articles, the earlier article is just a very plain case based on knowledge of war that we would not succeed against China because of its commitment to the island of Taiwan. And then the other article is highlighting that othering, which I think has more resonance for people who pay attention to the racism that has surged in the United States, the anti-Asian hatred that has surged in the last year and a half to 2 years. So now let's turn to this video. I have this clip queued up because since this was published in state media, it was mentioned by a foreign minister in China who, first off, before we play the video, it doesn't actually include the full statement, but what it does have is, so before he actually speaks and says what he says, generally, he mentions that the U.S. government can't let this person publish their 2 articles from within the Marines and put their name on it. And what he's referring to is the fact that the Global Times basically published his op-eds, and at the bottom they put a disclaimer that clearly stated that this was his opinion and not the U.S. government's opinion. So it's not like they even treated it like he was representing the U.S. government in order to drive a wedge between into U.S. policy. But of course, the U.S. These U.S. officials that have placed him under investigation can't have any independence of thought from the groupthink that's within our institutions. And so now I'll play this clip where the minister went on to add to the hypocrisy of the United States.
事实上，类似情况在美国俯拾皆是。新冠肺炎疫情期间，我们看到美国国内疫情吹哨的朱海伦医生，恳请卫生部门为疑似病人检测的麦卡锡医生写信呼吁撤离罗斯福号航母舰上官兵的克罗泽尔舰长等许多人向美国政府谏言，他们仅仅因为说了真话，发出同政府不一致的声音，就遭到晋升或被调查撤职。美方在谈论言论自由时，应该多照照镜子，而不是整天拿着放大镜去看别人。
Okay, so that was obviously in Mandarin, and so for people who are premium subscribers of the Dissenter Newsletter and will be listening to this in podcast form later, I'd just like to go back and read what he was saying, and then I'll go ahead and include the full statement that he made about the op-eds that ran in the Chinese press. So someone from Global Times actually raised the issue. That's how we got this comment from the foreign minister. And the Global Times asked, is reported that Franz Gale, a retired U.S. Marine major who is now working at the Pentagon, is under a counterintelligence investigation by the Marine Corps for his 2 articles published in the Global Times that criticized open confrontation with China by the U.S. regarding Taiwan. Reports say he could face an early exit from the civil service. What is China's comment on this? And so then the minister's name is Zhao Lijian. And he said, I think many people would want to ask, isn't the U.S. a self-proclaimed champion of the freedom of speech and justice? Franz Gale is under investigation just because he wrote 2 articles expressing a different position from the U.S. government. Why can't the U.S. allow 2 articles clearly marked to represent the author's personal opinion? And then he goes on to cite several other examples of what China views as cases where they have actually attacked whistleblowers, cracked down on freedom of speech. So they say similar cases abound in the U.S. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, many people in the U.S. have spoken out. Dr. Helen White Chu, a whistleblower, sounded the alarm on the epidemic in the U.S. Dr. McCarthy entreated U.S. health authorities to test suspected cases. Captain Brett Crozier of the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt wrote a letter to Navy leaders asking that most of the crew be taken ashore. These people have been either muzzled, investigated, or dismissed from their posts just because they told the truth that the government doesn't like. Is this the way the U.S. champions the freedom of speech? When clamoring for freedom of speech, the U.S. side should really look at itself in the mirror rather than look at others through a magnifying glass. So you get the clip, you get the translation there, and obviously China's weaponizing freedom of speech and human rights against the U.S. The United States is going to weaponize human rights and freedom of speech issues against China, and people who are under attack will be caught in the middle. But above all, what it points out is that our country, for Americans here in the U.S., we really do not have any grounds to lecture China when it comes to the treatment of their people, because right now we are letting someone who is a very well-respected Marine be pushed into retirement in disgrace because he dared to use a platform that we have now begun to decide should be censored, that we should not be able to access. It isn't just that we're not supposed to read Chinese state media, but we saw the U.S. government seize Iranian state-funded news websites in the past week and take those down. We've seen attacks on other state-funded news sources. Primarily what this means is that we're not able to know what those governments that our U.S. government opposes is up to, what they're up to, what they think about U.S. policy. And it just divides and makes it easier for policies of war to have success. And so I think we'll continue to follow Franz Gale's case. I think what he's doing is very admirable. He's near retirement and ready to move on from his service at the Pentagon at this point. I don't believe that's what he wanted to do. I don't know that in the last 6 months he was ready to bring everything to an end, but he's moving onward. And so he seems to be at peace, but he's going to continue to be an outspoken person, not because he's being paid by China. In fact, he received no money for the articles in the Chinese press, but because he cares about this in the same way that Daniel Ellsberg cares about this. We talked about it on the show last week or a couple weeks ago, that Daniel Ellsberg obtained copies of a study on Taiwan Strait crisis back in the 1960s that have not been entirely declassified, that reveal the extent to which the U.S. was willing to use nuclear weapons in order to protect Taiwan from China. This is not something that is an issue of the past. It's coming back, sadly. And as we see pushes to refine and up our nuclear arsenal to make sure that it is, quote unquote, modernized and ready for any kind of conflict with rival power, that we have to be mindful of the threats that we could be facing from the provocations that could come and what it might mean to be sucked into a deep conflict. So I think Franz Gale is somebody that we really should celebrate for doing this and knowing that there's no benefit, knowing full well that the politics are so horrible that people in Capitol Hill and in the White House aren't going to want to listen to him, but still standing up and speaking anyways.
Thank you, Kevin, for that very thorough report. Why don't we round things out here? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on with Julian Assange and then lead us right into the newsletter while you're at it?
Yeah, so just to keep you up to date on the way Julian Assange is, how he happens to be doing in Belmarsh Security Prison. Now, obviously, this is a really rough time for him because of the uncertainty, not knowing when this appeal is going to take place, not knowing when he's going to get his date to go in there and defend the extradition decision because he won, but he didn't get bail. Judge Vanessa Baretzer essentially did a favor for the U.S. government in ensuring that he was not able to be out of jail while their appeal was being pursued in the High Court of Justice. We don't know if the High Court of Justice is going to take the appeal from the U.S. government. We do not know if they're going to agree with the grounds that they think they have for an appeal, but we wait for the High Court to say that they will hear the case and that they will have a date for reviewing it. His attorneys are interested in a cross appeal still because it did not uphold his press freedom. It did not recognize that he was a journalist who was engaged in work that was in the public interest. And so his brother, Gabriel, and his father, John, are still on tour in the United States. They've made their way to the West Coast. They're going to be in Los Angeles. Encourage you to go see them if they're doing a panel event or if they're going to be doing a rally or demonstration near a British consulate or embassy. You should go there and add your support for this case. You should join them in solidarity and call your Congress member and let them know that you do care about this, that not only do you care about this, but you do care about Espionage Act reform, and that it is not just about Julian Assange, but it's also this issue which you recognize that the Espionage Act should no longer be a law available to crush whistleblowers like Daniel Hale and Reality Winner, who we've covered on this show. So that's the update. I know there's some momentum internationally, some momentum in Europe, some momentum building in Australia, and we continue to see voices add their support for a push to drop the charges. So the dissenter.org is the newsletter that I encourage you to go to in order to listen to this in podcast form, but also to read some of the reports. We're doing original reporting on whistleblower cases, as well as occasionally there will be posts that are short hits coverage of whistleblower stories that are breaking. In addition to Franz Gale, I did a deep dive into the way the Supreme Court's decision that limited the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, what that would mean for people who were prosecuted under the Espionage Act and who are likely to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act going forward. And I think it's going to make it harder for prosecutors to apply the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to people like Chelsea Manning and Thomas Drake. So I'll just close by saying it's really sad that some people out there like Franz Gale continue to not have a place in the media that they can turn to for matters of war to be publicized so that they can warn us of things that we need to know. That was the case with Chelsea Manning. She went to WikiLeaks because the New York Times and the Washington Post didn't want her documents. That definitely was a big deal to hear that from her when she shared that in her court-martial about 9 years ago. And it seems to still be the case that we have a media that does not want to give any inches in their newspaper or any column space on their screens for individuals who want to blow the whistle on matters of war. So to counter that, we have journalism over at the Dissenter.org that I encourage you to support, subscribe to, and help fund. This is a project of Shadowproof, and it goes along with the work we're doing over at Shadowproof to support other things like coverage of prisons and policing. So with that, thanks, Brian, for being here as a host to lead us through these stories, to push the buttons and make sure that I don't look too disorganized as I'm trying to find all the tabs, trying to find all the tabs on my computer.
It's an outdated reference that maybe some of our viewers won't know, but I'm like your Vanna White, flipping the letters over. But yeah, no, thank you for that, Kevin. Very good show. Especially enjoyed reading and hearing you talk about the Pentagon whistleblower, Franz Gale. Highly encourage people to go to the dissenter.org, subscribe, not only for this story, but the other journalism that Kevin and his cohort is producing over there. And yeah, also encourage people, again, to subscribe and give, because you'll support Kevin, you'll support the people writing at the Dissenter, as well as the folks writing at Shadowproof. We've got some good stories we're still plugging away on, want to make sure they're as good as possible before we share them with the world. So hopefully after the 4th of July weekend, we'll start publishing some of those. I'm very excited to share them. And yeah, I just want to thank everybody. Yeah, go for it.
Well, you were about to wrap and I just stepped on it, but
no, it's okay.
I did want to say more than anything this week, although every week it's great to ask people to be generous, and if they have a couple bucks, throw it our way in order to support us. We got the tip jar going now on the newsletter. It's something I didn't have at Substack, but the tip jar is a nice way for people to give if they can't be regular paying subscribers. What I want to say is, more than anything, after an experience from the past week, I truly would be grateful if you would just share this video and let other people know that we're here, because I did a video, and we're not going to get into the issue. We're wrapping the show. We don't have time for this. This is for another fora. But we did it for another forum. But I talked with Rania Kalik about what's gone down over the last couple of weeks with the Young Turks. And we have concluded that there's something about the Young Turks that get extra juice in the Google algorithm. And it shows. Is if you go to our channel right now and you look at this video, it has, I think, over 2,500 views. It might have 3,000 views at this point. And there isn't a single Dissenter Weekly video that gets boosted more than 500 to 750 views. And we have the same subscribers. We have the same people coming to our channel. But you put Young Turks in the headline and you get extra juice for it, even if you're attacking the Young Turks. And to me, that just shows the kind of struggle we have as independent journalists, because we're doing real journalism here. I didn't just sit here wasting people's time for 40 minutes calling out people who I hate. I just gave people a bunch of information that I think gives them an awareness of what the government is doing to crush people who are conscientious individuals that deserve our support. Some of them win, some of them lose, but no matter what, we should be there for them so that they can succeed in their efforts. And so it just would mean a lot if, even if you've got just 10 or 15 people in your social network, that's better than zero. And so it means a lot if you just let people know that we're doing the show. And that way we don't have to sell out and just start finding easy targets every week so that we can get some juice on Google.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't have to become another tabloid publication. We say a lot with podcasts, if you rate, review, and subscribe, to the show, if you share it, all of that stuff helps other people find the show. It tells the computers that, we're interesting and that people should check us out. So again, if you're not in a place where you can give financially, that's totally fine. We completely understand. You can still help out just by word of mouth or by sharing or liking. All of that stuff builds on itself and helps us out. So, yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. I believe we're off next week. Is that correct, Kevin?
Yeah. I'm taking vacation. If any of you watching are able to take vacation, I encourage you to take a break. It's always stressful out there in the world, but I'll be back at it after 7 to 10 days with more coverage of these whistleblower stories that are really important.
Great. Well, everybody, just make sure you are following and subscribe wherever you're watching so that when we do come back, you will know about it. If you want to support us, you can donate where you are. You can go to the dissenter.org. You can go to shadowproof.com/donate. Take care of yourselves, and we will talk to you soon.